You're listening to She's the Business podcast.
Wow, welcome to the very first episode of She's the Business for 2023. Have you been thinking about launching a podcast this year? Now, if this is one of the things on your goals list, then this episode is exactly for you. It's all about the things that you need to know and think about before you launch your podcast with my very special guest and podcast expert, Anne Claessen.
Hi, I'm your host, Jessica Osborne, and in my 23 years of business and marketing, I've built many brands to become multi-billion-dollar companies. And just in the last 10 years, I've built 2 online businesses of my own from my dining room table with 2 little babies running around at my feet. I've made it my mission to inspire you to get out of your own way and become the successful business owner who's living the lifestyle you really desire without all the hustle. This is She's the Business podcast, made by women for women. This is your weekly dose of motivation and inspiration.
So is a podcast right for your business? Well, that's what we're diving into today with my very special guest, Anne Claessen, who's the founder of the Podcast Babes, which is a fully female podcast management and monetization agency. So she knows a thing or two about podcasts, how to really make them work for your business, how to monetize them, and also the what to do and the what not to do when it comes to the strategy around your podcast, how you launch it and how you run it. And shares so many of her personal experiences with her own podcast, as well as some of the great lessons and learnings that they've had helping to manage other people's podcasts. So I know you're going to absolutely love this episode. Without further ado, let me play it for you. Awesome. So today I'm here with the lovely Anne Claessen. She's from the Podcast Babes, and we're going to talk all about podcasts today, which I'm really excited about because although I have a podcast, I would never call myself an expert on podcasting. So I really want to get into this topic with Anne. Welcome, Anne. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Can you tell us a bit more about exactly what it is that you do with your business, like who it is that you serve and how you help them? And then I'd love to know how you even got into this in the first place. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it has been a journey. So first, I'll tell you what we do. So at the Podcast Babes, we help female podcasters with an important message to get that message out in the world. So it's mostly coaches, solopreneurs, business owners who want to get into more of like that thought leadership and be a thought leader in their industry. So that's who we help. And what we do is we do everything from the moment the podcast is recorded. So I didn't know this when I learned about podcast management and podcast production, but what usually happens is the podcast episode gets recorded, of course, but then after that, there's all these things that also need to happen, like audio editing. You have to write a description. It needs to go on the website. It needs to go on all the other places where it needs to go. Then you create promotion materials. All of that stuff is what we do for our clients.
Oh, amazing. There is a lot. And I have to say that I never started off doing it all myself, because I think that was one thing that was holding me back from starting the podcast, was just, I didn't even know where to begin. So to be honest, when I started mine, I did hire somebody to help. And I kind of went, tell me what you need from me and I'll give it. And then they stuck everything else together and kind of really guided a lot of that. So it's been great for me, but I know that there's so many people who are kind of embarking on this journey, or maybe thinking about it and wanting to do it on their own. So I think that you're going to have so much to tell us and share with us today. It's exciting. So how did you actually get started in this business? What brought you into podcast management and, really, I guess, niching into that area?
Yeah. So, well, I think, first of all, I've always loved podcasts. When I was in university, when I was studying, I was always this person in my friend group who was always, I listened to a cool podcast and I learned this and that, and you should definitely check out the episode. Like this was me every day to my friends, and I was that annoying person. First of all, like that's good to keep in mind for the rest of my story. I started traveling after university because I decided that the career path that kind of my goal was business. I was very close to getting the job that I wanted, the quote unquote dream job, when I decided I did not want to do it. I wanted to be a lawyer, an M&A lawyer to be specific, at a large firm in the Netherlands. I got the job lined up, got the degrees, and then I asked myself, do I really want to do this? Like, do I see myself do this every day? And the answer was actually a very clear no. But I've been working to this goal for years. So I was quite lost what the alternative was. So as a true millennial, I packed my bags and went backpacking in Southeast Asia to find myself, because I didn't know. I had no idea what I wanted to do with life, and especially my career. So on this journey, I learned about working online, remote work. I met digital nomads, and I knew about this like industry, if you will, or lifestyle, but I never thought it would be something I could do. I also always had in the back of my mind, okay, one day I want to start my own business. But I mean, too young, I don't have experience, I had all these excuses for myself why I couldn't do it yet. So on this journey, I just met a lot of people. I talked to a lot of people. I learned so much about myself, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, what I like, what I don't like, what's important to me. One thing that was really important to me was freedom, and also the opportunity to travel. So I thought, after about a year of traveling around and some odd jobs here and there to keep going, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to try. I will just start my business and see what happens. I don't have a career. I don't have an apartment. I don't have a partner. I don't have kids. So there is literally nothing to lose. I might as well give it a shot and see what happens, because it's just me. And, worst case scenario, I'll go home.
Get a job.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I still didn't really have an idea of what exactly I wanted to do. So I heard about, or I read a blog post about a course to become a virtual assistant. And I looked into this course and I thought, okay, maybe this is a good idea to just like kind of see what's out there, what things I could be doing, get into online business, like get to know business owners. And I could also do it while I kept traveling. So I was like, okay, I think this is perfect. And honestly, also, it sounded like a way to also get some revenue in relatively fast, because I was traveling and, I didn't have anything.
Yeah, definitely.
So I did that. And one of the modules in this course was podcast management. So this is where I learned that this whole industry existed behind the podcasts that I would just listen to because I like them so much. And that really opened a whole new world for me. And I was sold immediately. I was like, this is it.
This is it. This is the thing. Well, good on you for finding that so soon, because gosh, it took me a long time. Like, I think I did like you. Was, after the first year of university, I'm like, I want to go traveling. So I went traveling, didn't finish my degree. I was sort of, finding things. And I always wanted to start a business, but it took me 20 years before I actually went, right, this is the one, like the actual right one. I did dabble with a couple of smaller ones previously, but I think that's amazing to have done that journey so quickly. Now, tell me a bit about what you know about podcasting, because I think for me, even though they've been around forever, they're still relatively new in my world, as in I only started listening to them when I got into this online business space, probably 5.5 years ago, so almost 6 years ago now. And they obviously existed long, long, long before that. But what have you seen in terms of the podcast landscape? Like, are there a lot, how often are new podcasts coming out? How long do they stick around for? Like, what generally happens with a podcast? Like, are they something that people tend to start and stick with? Or are there a lot of ones that kind of start and then fizzle out?
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely option 2 about what you just said. Definitely. What happened over the past few years, when I started in the podcasting industry 3 years ago, there were about like 1 million podcasts out there. Sounds like a lot, but they were not all active. And also, if you compare that to the amount of blogs or YouTube channels, it's nothing compared to that. So it sounds like a lot, but it wasn't a huge industry yet, but there was a lot of growth happening, which was also why I was very interested in it. Now, 3 years later, I think we already have like between 3 and 4 million podcasts in 3 years, So that means that the amount of podcasts out there multiplied, like, and it grew so much. But what you said is actually right. Like, a lot of podcasts start and they fizzle out. It's called pod fade. Yeah. So what that means is that after a few episodes, I think the average is 7 to 10 episodes, the podcaster just does not produce new content anymore. And this is actually exactly what happened when I started my podcast. So I made all the rookie mistakes myself. So that means that I can tell you exactly about my experience and what to do, what not to do, especially what not to do from my experience. So what happened when I started my own podcast, I knew all the things I had to do because of this course that I took. I already worked with a few clients. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this thing for myself. I'm going to start my own podcast.
Yeah.
This will be easy because I know all the things. It was not easy. So I started recording and it was so exciting. When I started, I was like, yes, I'm going to be a podcaster. I will grow my audience, like, from scratch. I didn't have an audience, but I will grow my audience and people will start listening. And I don't know, like, I will create a brand around myself and this will be awesome. So I released my first, I would say, like, 3 episodes, and it was really fun. After that, episode 4 or 5, I looked at my download numbers and it actually went down. So I was like, what is happening? Like, people hate this. They don't like it. No one's listening. That's what I was telling myself. Yeah. So then I was busy. I just got busy by doing things in my business, in my personal life. And I thought, you know what, I'll just take a break. No one's listening anyway, so no one will know that there's no new episode this week. So I took a break. 1 week, another week, another week. And then 6 months later, it was like, oh yeah, I had this podcast, kind of forgot about this. And this is typically what happens with new podcasts. Now, I also want to
leads to that. Oh, sorry, you're about to say something. I'll let you carry on.
Oh, good. Yeah, what leads to that? I think it's really about expectations and mindset. I did bring back the podcast. After those 6 months of not producing new content, I realized something had to change when I brought back my podcast, because this was obviously not working for me. And it was just not a way to do this sustainably. So I asked myself, first of all, do I even really want this?
Yeah.
Am I willing to commit to this podcast? Not forever, but for a certain time. And then I really changed my goal for this podcast, especially my short-term goal. So before, my goal was really to grow an audience, and seeing those download numbers was really important to me. But the thing is, especially with a new podcast, a lot of things are out of your control. There's certain things that you can do to get new downloads and new people in. But if this becomes so important to you that you get discouraged and disappointed when download numbers go down, then it gets really difficult to keep going. So the second time around with this podcast, I thought, you know what, I will restart this podcast and I will not look at download numbers. Like, it's fine. My main goal with this podcast right now is to have interviews with amazing people and to produce this podcast, like the actual podcast production. That was my goal, to just have a lot of fun recording, meeting new people by doing these interviews, having really good conversations, and then putting that out there in the world, in the podcast space. Yes. And then from that moment on, it's fine. Like, whatever happens, it's all good, because I reached my goal already. At the moment that this episode went live, my goal was reached. So that was the mindset that I started with. And I set kind of an ambitious goal also for the commitment that I wanted to have for my podcast. So I thought, I will wonder what happens when I do this weekly episodes for 1 year. Sounds like a little bit like I need to push myself for that. Like, it's not easy, but I think it would be a fun experiment. I actually reached that. Like, I did that 1 episode per week for a year. And sometimes it was uncomfortable. And I was like, my episodes go live on Monday morning. So sometimes on Sunday evening, I was editing this podcast a little bit angry at myself. Why am I doing this? And I had to remind myself, I'm doing this because this is fun. But that mindset shift made the biggest difference for me. So if you do start a podcast, learn from my experience and know that this is a possible situation that you can find yourself in.
Yeah. So what would you say are the most important things to kind of consider? You mentioned committing to it. So obviously deciding this is something you really, really want and you're going to commit to it, because the podcast is probably about that consistency, and it will take some effort to put it together. What other factors do you think that somebody should think about and kind of, really get on board with before they start?
Yeah, I think it comes back to those clear expectations. Well, on the one hand, what I just said, but also clear expectations of what goes into podcast production.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, you have a team who helps you with the podcast. I also have a team who helps me with the podcast. Now, when I started, I did everything myself. And I think there's no right or wrong, especially when you start a podcast. If you want to do everything yourself, that's totally fine. I would say you can do that if you want, but there needs to be some kind of investment. It's either time or money that goes into producing a podcast. And depending on your situation, what makes most sense for you, you can choose. But I think it's very important to do your research before you start, so that you know how many hours per week will this thing cost me, or how much money will this thing cost me, or like what is this investment that I'm going to do, and is this realistic? When you don't have any time and you don't have the budget to produce this podcast, well, then you can start it, but you cannot keep going. So I think those expectations are very, very important, because like you said, that commitment and consistency, you can produce a podcast and just put an episode out there whenever you want and whenever you feel like it. It's not that it's impossible. There are people who do this and they're successful in their podcast, but it really depends on what your goal is with this podcast. If you already have an existing audience and you just want to share a specific message with this existing audience, they already know you, they already have a basic level of trust with you, and you just want to educate them about a certain topic whenever that makes sense, then yes, this is a great strategy. If you don't have an audience and you want new people to find you and to build trust with new people, then you just have to be consistent. You have to show up consistently to build that trust. So then you really want to make sure that you can also keep going, and that you don't find yourself in that situation where I was at. After a few episodes, I didn't have time anymore. And then it was just like, oh, well, like whatever.
Yeah, I think that's such an important one. And like you say, there is no right or wrong way to do it, but it's probably choosing a consistency that works for you, that you're going to be able to keep up with. I was like you, I actually committed to 2 episodes a week when I started, and I did that for a whole year. And that was intense. And earlier this year, it was my 100th episode. I made an announcement. I said, I've reached 100. I've done 100 in a year. And I've decided to drop it down to 1 episode a week. So I'm just spacing it out. So now I'm doing 1, which feels to me like a lot easier, because I was doing 2, but 1 is still a lot. And there's many podcasts that don't do a weekly episode. So I think it's, for me, I'm like, well, I'm not committing to that forever, but right now that's, what feels good to me is doable, and I've got great content. I think as soon as I start feeling like, oh, I don't have enough to share that often, then I definitely would look at dropping it back again. And that's okay, right? It's like, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I can make that decision. And I think when you're starting out, especially if you're going to do it on your own, just knowing what I find, even having a team, I think, giving yourself more time than what you realize you're going to need is going to be really key. So spacing it out, or committing to a consistency that you actually can keep up, so that you're not one of those statistics of the ones that really fizzle out. Those are some really great points. And I think that you're right as well about the purpose of it. What is the goal of the podcast? What are you doing it for? And what is your expectation? Because like with anything we do in business, there's going to be ups and downs. You're going to have the weeks where there are less downloads. What does that actually mean? Or what are you making it mean? It doesn't even mean anything. And what are you doing it for? So I think often we've got this idea, or, you know, you might see people out there who have a podcast and they're really successful. So people are like, oh, I've got to just do what they're doing and then I'll have the same success. So doing a podcast, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to suddenly have all this business success. What is the actual purpose that you're doing it for? Because if you try it and you're not getting somewhere, then it can quickly become a burden and something that you're then not wanting to continue with, probably because it didn't meet those expectations. So I'd love to lead this into, what do you think are the success factors of a good podcast? Like, what makes a podcast really sticky, like, you know, something that somebody wants to come back and listen to, that you see the best podcasters out there doing? What do you say? There are top 3 things that make a podcast really great or successful?
Oh, let's see.
Sorry, I'm just throwing you in the deep end with my questions.
No, it's a great question. It's absolutely a great question. So I think number 1 is having a value first approach. So this can look really different depending on what your podcast is about, who you speak to. But a value first approach to me just means that you make sure that in every single episode, you provide amazing value to your audience, and not just to like an audience, but to your specific ideal listener. Because just as much as we have an ideal client in business for a podcast, I think you should also have an ideal listener, a persona, one person you speak to on every episode. And I think that the value that you provide should not be, okay, well, it is valuable, but no, it should be very valuable. You know?
We all think our own stuff is valuable, right? Having that view, well, is this valuable to them? Are they going to really find it valuable?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I think this should lead every decision you make about your podcast. So if you bring in sponsors, yes or no, what kind of sponsors, how often, you know, like things like that, what you offer on your podcast, if you offer, or if you sell your own services or products, do you go from 2 episodes a week to 1 episode a week? Or because maybe that is also a value decision, right? Maybe you can give more value if you only do 1 episode per week instead of 2, because it gives you more time. I think this is just the number 1 question you should ask yourself if you make your podcast successful. And then there are some things that you can do. Well, consistency, I think we already talked about that one. And another thing that I would like to add, maybe as the number 3 in this list, if you will, I think audio branding is also important. What I mean by that is like the music that you use in your episodes, the like audio quality, the microphone, the things that you say, like maybe you have a catchphrase, or maybe it's just your voice. I think your voice is also audio branding, but having all of that consistently makes it really easy for people to recognize your podcast. And that is what you want. With your podcast, you're also building a brand, and it's quite unique compared to other ways to build a brand, because people actually hear you. And some people, like, you can do video podcasts, of course, but a lot of people will still listen just to audio. So there's a little bit, maybe a different perspective on branding than what you would usually have. But I think these things, thinking about your podcast branding, I think is important.
Yeah, I love that one. I totally agree. And I think that the real exciting thing to me is the senses, right? So when we talk about branding, how many of the 5 senses are we actually touching our audience with? And traditional marketing, the things that we do traditionally, are often just visual, as in it's looking and you're reading. But when they're reading your content, they're not reading it in your voice, they're reading it in their own voice. And so it can take on a different meaning. It can apply different context sometimes. Whereas when they're actually listening to you, and then also getting, so visual, audio, you know, the more senses we can be touching, then the more powerful that connection is that we're making with the audience. So I love that you've mentioned that, because that's a really simple thing to think about, but it's something that no one would sit there and really take notice of unless they are into branding and really paying attention to it. But your listeners will subconsciously get that recognition from listening to you, from your style, like you said, the quality, the music, all of those little things join together to create that experience that they're having of your brand. And it can be so powerful. Like, they're not going to think, oh, I like the sound of that, so I'm going to, you know, reach out, but they're going to enjoy it. So they're going to listen more. They might follow, they're going to, consume their content. So I love that. Now, you did mention in there about sponsorship. So I wanted to ask you on the topic of, I guess, monetizing your podcast. How much of a thing is this? How many people are doing it? Is it worthwhile? Is that a reason why, I guess, is that a strategy that some people have for the podcast? Because I'm keen to hear a bit about it. I don't currently do any monetization of my own one, but I know that some people do. And I've heard, obviously a lot of platforms allow you to insert ads at different places. And, I've heard podcasts with that happening. I'm just interested to hear from your point of view, let's lay it out. What are the pros and cons of it? What's the value of it? Why would you want to monetize your podcast, apart from the obvious of earning money? But yeah. What do you think?
Yes. Okay. Let me start with that one. Why is it important to monetize a podcast? Because I do think it's important to monetize a podcast. Podcasting, it's expensive. It costs money. It costs a lot of time if you do everything yourself, which is great. I mean, that's cool. But I do think it's really important to see a return on investment at one point, because that allows us to keep going and to impact more people with our message. So I do think it's very important to monetize a podcast. Like, people spend hundreds of dollars every month to produce a podcast. And I mean, unless you're, I don't know, very rich, but otherwise there comes a point that you got to stop putting that much money into, what is it? I don't want to call it a hobby necessarily, but it's usually also not necessarily meant to be a charity. So then what do? I think monetizing a podcast, because you want to make sure that you can put in your time and effort into this like channel to spread your message. I do want to mention there are many ways to monetize a podcast. A lot of podcasters, first thing they think about is sponsorships, but there are a lot of ways to monetize a podcast, especially for business owners. I would say the main monetization strategy to consider is selling your own services or products. That is the most profitable way to monetize a podcast. I would also say the easiest way to monetize a podcast. If you already have your services or products, especially. Yeah,
definitely. Well, I do that. I guess.
Exactly.
I lied. I don't monetize it in terms of getting money from other people, but I do definitely provide some lead magnets and ways where I talk about my programs and my offerings where it's appropriate. So yes, in that way, I suppose I do monetize it, which is good.
Yeah, that is great. Absolutely. And the best thing about this is you don't need thousands of people listening to your podcast every week, because even if you have 10 people listening and one person decides to become a client, cool, you have a great return on investment on this podcast. So I think that's also really good to keep in mind, depending on how you want to monetize your podcast. And I think that also makes it important to think about podcast monetization and what kind of strategy you can use to have a general idea when you start your podcast. Not saying sell in your first episode. That's not what I'm saying, but having an idea of what your monetization strategy would be and what your podcast would need to look like to make that happen. So when you're a business owner and you want to sell services, you don't need thousands of people listening. You want a select few ideal clients listen to your podcast and create content that leads to signing up with you. It sounds really easy. If your goal is more to help a lot of people and you don't have services or products that you offer, then maybe a sponsorship makes way more sense. Maybe you don't want to get clients or customers out of your audience. Maybe you just want to provide this value for free for the audience, but you still want a monetary return on investment. So then working with sponsors is an option to consider. Also within sponsorships, there are different ways that you can do. So what you mentioned, there are companies who will place ads in your podcast. You just flip a switch and there's an ad in your podcast and you get paid depending on how many listens you have on that ad. But there's also the sponsorship model where you have a direct relationship with the brand that sponsors your podcast. If you don't, especially if you have a smaller niche audience, I highly recommend doing that instead of the more random ads. Because these ads, they don't necessarily have anything to do with the topic that you talk about, which is why it's very important how many people exactly listen. And these brands need the thousands and thousands of listens, because it's just random people, right?
The conversion rate would be so low on that, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. So it's like a TV ad. It's just I don't know, it's just
they're just paying for awareness. That's it.
Yes. If you have a direct relationship with a brand, usually this brand is very interested in your specific audience. So that's very valuable to them. That also means that you can charge a lot more money for this kind of sponsorship. And I also would argue that this is also better for your audience, because it's generally a product that your audience might be interested in. It has something to do with them, right? That's why this brand wants to reach them. I'll give you an example. So my podcast, it's called Digital Nomad Stories, and I interview digital nomads about the lifestyle, about things like that. And I work with companies. I have sponsors on my podcast who have products or software for digital nomads. So what I would love to happen is that a brand sponsors my podcast and they offer something that is super interesting to my audience. So my audience is, wow, great tip. Cool, let me check that out. The brand gets these people in the door, which are ideal clients for them, and I get money.
Yeah,
that's the win-win that
great.
I'm going for.
It is a win-win. Yeah, absolutely. And
I do think
valuable
that is
as well, isn't it? Like that's the whole thing. It's still aligned with value because it's something that your ideal customer, it's relevant for them and of interest to them. So you're not just sort of throwing a generic ad in front of their face. It's actually really tailored for them.
Yes, exactly. I think that is honestly where the magic is. Because I think it is possible to make it a win-win for everyone. And it takes a bit more effort compared to just flipping a switch and getting a random ad in your podcast. It's very easy to do that. And I think if you just do your podcast more as a hobby, if you produce your podcast as a hobby and you kind of accidentally grew quite a large audience and you're like, oh, well, why not? Cover some of the costs, then yes, definitely do it. Because working with brands in this way, there's actually quite a bit of work that goes into that. Like you have to communicate with the brand, you have to negotiate a sponsorship, come up with a sponsorship or like campaign that works for both parties, have a contract, and then you have a call. And, there's work that goes into this. I feel like it sounds a little bit easier than it is, and like the more work goes into it than what it sounds like.
The concept is like, I could do that, but then it's like all the stuff in the background that you haven't kind of figured out what to do. So I think that is important to know, though. There's many other ways to monetize a podcast. Like you can do so many things, so which is also really cool. I have a client, they have a membership around their podcast. Okay.
You can think of affiliate marketing, which a lot of bloggers do, but you can also do that on podcasts. You can run events. Like there's so many things you can do.
Yeah, it's incredible actually. And just thinking about it, there's sort of that direct as well as indirect ways where you might, so ads obviously are a lot more direct because you're literally saying to them, hey, there's this thing and if you're interested, go here, and giving them that call to action. Whereas I find as well a lot of clients come to me and they just slip in there some way. Oh yeah, I was listening to your podcast and that's how I got to know you and I decided to reach out. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And this has happened again and again. And so obviously that's not a direct means. Like I haven't said, hey, I want clients, come and click here and book in a call with me. I never invite people to do that, but I do invite them to check out some of my online programs. They might have listened to episodes though, and then they've gone and done their own sort of research in the background and decided to reach out. So it's really interesting when you think about it, and you've got to give this a bit of time. This has been, so I'm just thinking back, mine has been up and running for just over a year. Obviously, I said I reached my 100 episodes in a year and I decided to drop down to one a week. But it's, that's sort of taken a bit of time. I think you've got to give it time to really see, well, is this working? Does it work? And of course, we have goals with it. I'd be interested to hear from you. What are the key metrics that you think a podcaster should be looking at or tracking in order to, I guess, really get the feel for, is the podcast actually providing the value that you think it should for your business?
Yeah, I think great question, especially because this is a question that I see in Facebook groups, especially a lot, where people ask, okay, I started my podcast, I'm 1 month in, I have this amount of downloads, is this good? I totally understand the question, like I've been there, but I think it's the wrong question in that sense, right? Because it's comparing this podcast with other podcasts, and that is just impossible. Your situation is different, your audience is different, your content is different, you just cannot compare it. However, I think there is a comparison that you need to make, and that is with your past self. So you can always compare your podcast this month to your podcast last month, or to your podcast this year to your podcast last year. And I do think that those metrics are very important to look at. So when I open my hosting platform for my podcast, where I see all the stats, what I look at is how is my podcast performing now compared to last week or last month. You could even do last year, if that makes sense. But is it performing better, or is it performing worse? Is there growth? If yes, cool, it's working.
Yeah. And so is downloads the key metric that you should be tracking? Is there anything else that you look at?
What I also look at is if there's any outliers in the episodes. So I try to figure out what kind of content works well for my audience that I currently have. If there's an episode with definitely less downloads, like very obviously less downloads than other episodes or than the average, then that is a sign of something. So then I ask myself, did I do anything different here in terms of promotion? Maybe the guest didn't share it, that's possible. Or if there's any other reason, if there's no reason, okay, maybe this topic just didn't resonate as well. Maybe it's also the title. That's also what I would say. Like sometimes titles make or break an episode in that regard. So, but that's a sign that I have to look into that. If I see that happening to several episodes on the same topic, then I know, okay, this topic is just not working. But also the other way around. If I see that one episode performs really well, I had that on my podcast where I had a few episodes about dating as digital nomads. And I mean, I understand it's a juicy episode. I would listen to it. But apparently a lot of people thought the same. So that episode performed really well. So I got another person on to also talk about dating as digital nomads. And that episode also performed really well. So now I'm like, okay, cool. I can do more of this content. So I think looking at these outliers is also really important in that sense. And then you can see some things like where people listen from could be interesting, especially when you're talking to brands about a potential sponsorship. They want to know things about your audience, like who is listening. And compared to Google Analytics or things like that, you don't know that much about your audience, but there are some things that you know. You can also see on what app or platform people listen, which could be interesting, like in terms of how you promote, like what links or things you promote. So that could be interesting. But I think overall, I would just look at growth in download numbers. Usually I track month to month, but you can also see like year to year, and the outliers. I think those are the two key metrics.
Yeah, awesome. So you look at sort of the overall podcast month to month, and then per episode as well, like what might be your highest or your lowest episodes in terms of the amount of downloads, and then dive into that. I love that. Yeah, because it just gives you that clue. There's something that's gone on. What is it that's either made it really successful or has led to it being less successful? And I completely agree that the subject line can make or break your episode. I've seen so many, I think I spend probably equally or more time on the subject line than I do on the actual caption because it is so important. Like no one's going to click on the episode to listen if it doesn't sound interesting. So
I have a quick tip for that, because what a lot of podcasters do is they start a description of the podcast, the show notes. In this episode, we talk about, and then they go into it. So quick tip, if you already have a podcast or if you're serious about starting one, write this down. You want to start the very first sentence, the first few words of the show notes need to be enticing. This is your hook. Because in Spotify and Apple Podcasts, people only see the title and like a few words of your description, and then it gets cut off and you have to click read more or click into it. So you really want to make sure that you don't waste any of the space that you have there. So just a quick tip for the podcasters out there.
Totally. Because I think, I completely agree. And, that bit about in this episode, blah, 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 where you're kind of breaking down the content, that can come after that. You really want to get their interest levels in with the hook, ask a question or hit them with something that's like a surprising fact or something like that really gets them to think, wow, I need to read more. I need to listen into this. It sounds really relevant. That's amazing. Thank you so much for those tips. Now, if people wanted to learn more, because I think we've covered a lot about podcasts in this episode, we've probably got everybody there going, oh, this sounds like exciting. Maybe you've been on the fence with the podcast for a while and you're thinking about it and you've got all motivated today. But where could people link up with you, learn more about it, really get into some of the content that you share? Because there's so much more that goes into it, of course. So how could they find you, Anne?
Yeah, go to thepodcastbabes.com. You can find the Podcast Babes podcast, of course, where you can listen to episodes. We mostly talk about growing and monetizing podcasts. I also have a really fun little quiz on the website. It's new. I created it last month and I'm very, very excited about this one. So it's 9 questions. It's super quick and it tells you which monetization strategy is right for you. So not just for your podcast, but also for you as a person with your lifestyle, doing what you do. So you can also find that one on the website. You can also find out more about our offers. If you're looking to outsource podcast management, you can also find out how to get in touch with us and what we offer exactly, a little bit more of the details there. Also links to our socials and everything it's all on the website. So yeah, it's all on the website,
thepodcastbabes.com. I will link that up in the show notes for you. And the quiz, it sounds like a really interesting one to do. Do you have a favorite social platform that you hang out on more than the others? Like if someone wanted to follow you on the socials, are you Instagram, are you Facebook, or are you something more funky? New age.
I'm not funky. It's just Instagram, I'm afraid.
Awesome. Instagram, that's my main platform as well. So
yeah.
Great. And is that at the Podcast Babes as well? Is that
at the Podcast Babes.
Find you?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been really exciting. I loved the episode and I loved everything that you brought to it today. You've given me a lot to think about as well. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us, Anne.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessica. This was super fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to have to check out your podcast because you might, I don't know, well, you probably don't know, but I'm heading off in a caravan for 8 months around Australia with the family.
Wow.
So literally my business is becoming fully remote, even though I already work online, but I'm going to be remote and nomadic. So
awesome.
It's a lot of fun. I'm going to, link up with you and get some tips on that whole nomadic life. Brilliant. Thank you. And I'll talk soon. Do you know something? There are so many people that are overcomplicating their marketing, which means that they're running on the marketing treadmill, pumping out so much content, but still not yielding those results, meaning there are no clients actually signing up. Like, what use is an audience if they're not an audience of buyers? What use is it creating great content to share if the people who are reading it have no desire to take that next step to actually working with you? Well, if any of those things are happening for you right now, then it's highly likely that you're simply missing a key in your marketing strategy. And those keys are really simple. There are just 5 of them. And it's about how you align them, put them together. That is the simplicity that makes everything work, just like clockwork, so that you have a consistent stream of what you would consider your dream clients, literally turning up in your inbox, ready to have a conversation, ready to sign up with you without you going out there to find them. So let's put an end to cold outreach. Let's put an end to searching for clients in Facebook groups. Let's put an end to just waiting around and relying on referrals to come through from other people. Because when you have that consistent stream of clients, then you're in the place of being able to choose. You've got an abundance of opportunity out there, and all we need to do is turn on the tap for your clients to find you. So I've created a brand new training, and it's called 5 Keys to Clients on Tap. So you can guess what it's about, can't you? Well, this 1-hour short training takes you through those 5 critical keys that you need to have in your business so that you do have clients on tap, and not just any old client, the ones that you most want to be working with, that are going to make you profitable, that are going to fulfill you, are going to make you feel like jumping out of bed every morning because you love your business so much. So you want in? All you need to do is head to jessicaosborne.com/TMF for the magnetic formula. So TMF, and get yourself into the next session that's running for this training. You honestly will not regret it. It is going to change your business, your life, if you've been experiencing any of those problems I mentioned before. Look forward to seeing you in there, and let's do this.